What you're about to hear is the eulogy that I delivered for my father, D. Mark Hawkings, who was born in 1930 and died on December 8th, 2016. The funeral was held a week later at All Saints Church in Bay Head, New Jersey, near where he had retired. Several hundred people attended, many of them the same people who had attended my mother's funeral there in 2010. Among those in attendance were my wife, Betsy, our sons, Harry and Charlie, my sister, Parrish Ryan, and her husband, Dudley, and their daughter, Wren. The last time I stood at this lectern, amazingly, just one day short of 6 years ago, I got a decent laugh with my opening line about how our mother probably liked most of the people who had gathered for her memorial. Well, this is a very different moment because our parents forged their terrific marriage from two very different personalities. There is no doubt that Mark Hawkins had good things to say about everyone here. Literally every single one of you. He counted friends who were 8 and 88. He loved asking you questions. He listened for your answers. He was really eager to laugh out loud with you, and plenty often at his own expense. He rarely ventured into the subtle complexities of his inner demons. Very emotional and far too controversial, he'd exclaim, because his unwavering sense of self was to remain an optimist and a gentleman. He would describe almost all his encounters as simply marvelous, or at a minimum, very interesting. This was true when he spent a long evening by his Mount Street fireplace or on his Barnegat Lane back porch, solving all the problems of the world with Parrish and me, Betsy and Dudley, Wren and Harry and Charlie. But this was just as true after he'd struck up a conversation with a perfect stranger, someone at a roadside pub or in line at the hardware store, or buying tickets with him to the latest Jennifer Lawrence movie, or outside the bank, or in a doctor's waiting room. Fellow patrons, random passengers on a plane, retail clerks, restaurant servers, medical residents, the parents of the children he befriended, the children and the grandchildren of his friends, the friends of his children and his grandchildren. He did not count any of them as strangers for very long. He rarely remembered names, or else mangled them into comedic oblivion. But he always met people where they are, absorbed their stories, and relished retelling them. And he was just as eager to tell his own stories, oftentimes with ample embellishment. He was never one who settled for going through the motions. If you're going to do something, then do it right, he'd say. And so he was committed to living all of his 86 years in the fullest way that he knew how. His British stiff upper lip manifested itself from an early age as an enviable coolness and resolve in the face of danger and disappointment. It was a version of the right stuff that made him as much of a hero to members of our family as was John Glenn, who died the same day as Dad. Now, along the way, he attracted a collection of nicknames that reflected aspects of a life that was rooted in Edwardian-era England, blossomed through the American century, but kept going strong well into what he called this modern world. He began life as Marcus, a somewhat sickly boy who grew up just off Sloane Square in London until a week before his 10th birthday. That was when Angela and Rex Hawkins put him on a steamship and headed him off to live in America with foster parents who he'd never met for as long as the war might last. Then he was known as Bawley. It was a term of endearment that was coined by his sister Penny, but it carried through his beloved years at St. Paul's, and then for 3 years back in England as a proud infantry officer in the Grenadier Guards, and then through his swashbuckling bachelor days in New York. By the way, he returned to the U.S. for good after his career in the British Army came to an end entirely for economic reasons. Because in those days, you couldn't get promoted to captain unless you had enough money to buy your own horse. He was Mark to no one more passionately and emphatically than Susan Hawkings. On the surface, he may have seemed to have been a little bit harassed, but it was not that at all. He was for her what she was for him. The only person that the other ever totally and completely allowed themselves to rely upon. He was life of the party Mark. He may have spent many long days alone with his bushes and his flower beds, weeding and pruning with precision until a foul mood finally lifted. If more people did more gardening and drank more vodka, he'd say, there'd be much less of a need for psychiatrists. But he never failed to brighten up for any social gathering. He was filled with the same cheer and exuded the same charm, whether it was in his short-waisted pinstripe suit at the City Midday Club in New York, or in his faded green bathing suit at South Beach in Mandeloking, or only in his birthday suit while undergoing cancer treatment at Sloan Kettering Hospital. He was monochromatic Mark, the family's nod to his uncanny ability to assemble outfits in which the trousers, the shirt, and the sweater, or else the suit and tie, were all clashing versions of the same color palette. Navy to periwinkle in the summer, generally maroon to pink in the winter. This also pointed to his abiding attention to routine. Precisely measured bowls of fruit and cereal every morning, the daily ocean swim, but only just as the lifeguards were leaving for the day, cocktail cruises on such a specific course that the boat could essentially steer itself, a nightcap after dinner that, no matter what had been prepared, he always hoped, or else assumed, was chicken. Church always at 8, communion only on Sunday, followed by a long walk to inspect, and often trespass in, all the construction sites he could find. He was Shark to his grandsons, and Karki to his granddaughter. Rin was his princess and the object of the most doting behavior of his life. Harry and Charlie got their share of special treatment too. They loved their trip with him down memory lane in England, of course, but they were equally appreciative of the challenge to live up to his exacting standards for such household tasks as maintaining the swimming pool. He was Dr. No, who applied his very straightforward moral code to the intricacies of zoning regulations during his 16 years on the planning board. It's really very simple. A rule is a rule, was his mantra in those meetings, and in our house as well. And so it was hard to persuade him that sometimes it was not always appropriate to reduce the most complicated interpersonal or geopolitical topics to the simplest terms possible. And that often led him to invoke another mantra in order to end the inevitable arguments. Anything for peace. Nor was it always appropriate to make the simplest things as complicated as possible, which was also his wont, as you'd know if you ever tried to take a driving direction from him. Just down the road and round the bend, a bit before the bridge, you'll see a lovely tree on the opposite side. He was the man with the eyes. Penetrating, twinkling, totally mesmerizing, and the color of a September morning sky. They captivated everyone, from debutantes in the 1950s to his doctors just a few weeks ago. Those are some blues, one of them said, sounding surprised that she'd let her professional guard down at the bedside. Oh, I wish they worked for me like they used to, he replied, his eyebrows arched. And the doctor kept the flirtation going. Don't worry, Mr. Hawkings, they're still working for you, I promise. He probably did love women more than men, and he did expect different behaviors from men than from women. But he understood that his inherent sexism and his assumptions about traditional gender roles were not his best self. And the more people that he met, and the more family members that he came to understand, the better he got at embracing the nuances of this modern world. He was a man who felt deeply patriotic toward both his native land and his adopted country, a quality that we'll underscore in a moment when we sing the iconic British and American lyrics set to the same familiar tune. And he was a man of a deep and simple faith, a quality best summed up by the most quintessential Mark Hawkins saying of all, the one he used to sum up almost every conversation. And there we are.
And my father met me there in 1945. I was 15. And my favorite story there is that I felt that I was extremely mature and enjoyed smoking. And my father had spent a lot of money reserving 2 first-class seats in the train down from Glasgow to London. And it was 2 armchair seats with a table in between. And I was very nervous to see him, obviously, because I left him at 9 and I was now 15. And so I got up occasionally, quite occasionally, to go to the bathroom because I wanted to have a cigarette to relax me. And when we got to London and we were reunited with my mother, practically the first thing that my father said to my mother was, "We've got to get a good urologist for our son. I think he's got a bad case of cystitis." So that was my reuniting with my family.